A cartel enforcer smashed a bottle over a Navy SEAL's head. Seconds later, the entire bar floor erupted in fists, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He cracked a bottle across a stranger's head, laughing as glass rained down on the floor. Subscribe if you believe no bully walks away undefeated. The glass clinked softly as Daniel Rourke set it back on the bar counter, water half finished, untouched by anything stronger. Around him, the dim buzz of low conversations and scraping stools gave the rusted anchor its usual evening rhythm, a rhythm Daniel felt but did not join. He sat alone, elbows resting on the counter, back straight, head slightly tilted as if listening to something others couldn't hear. His eyes scanned the mirror behind the bar, not out of vanity, but to watch the movements behind him, reflected shapes of strangers too quick to laugh and too slow to hide their curiosity. Outside, the streets of San Relvas curled like smoke around the edges of law. Inside the bar, that same law felt optional, traded away with every nod between men who carried scars beneath their coats. Daniel noticed everything, the heavyset man near the dartboard slipping something into his boot, the off-duty officer at the far table tapping his phone twice before placing it face down, the bartender's subtle glance toward the back door every time it creaked. None of it alarmed him. He had seen worse in places where life cost less than a bullet and silence was the only currency that bought survival. But it wasn't the room that held his tension, it was the moment. A sense that something was shifting, just enough to break the balance. He reached for the glass again, fingers wrapped in calloused strength. His knuckles bore tiny white scars, the kind that come from training ropes and breaching charges, not bar fights. As he drank, the cold water did little to cool the heat in the room. The kind of heat that doesn't come from temperature but from watching eyes, lingering too long, thinking too hard. "Only tourists order water," the bartender said without looking up, drying a glass with a rag stained from long shifts. His voice was dry, worn from years of surviving conversations that didn't want truth. "I'm not thirsty for trouble," Daniel replied, not smiling. The bartender finally glanced up, studied Daniel's face for a moment, then nodded once. He didn't ask questions. Men like Daniel didn't walk into places like this unless they had their reasons. Daniel's reflection in the mirror flickered slightly as someone passed behind him. Tall, broad, laughing too loudly. A slap on the back. A boast about a fight settled in the street earlier that week. Daniel didn't turn. He listened. Listened for tone, for threat, for the sharp edge of pride that often came before chaos. He had come to San Relvas not to be seen, not to be known. The city offered shadows deep enough to hide in if you didn't make noise. After what he'd done, what he'd survived, noise was a luxury he could no longer afford. A chair scraped loudly behind him. Someone sat just 2 stools over. Too close for coincidence. The bar wasn't full enough to demand crowding. Daniel didn't move. He breathed slower, watched the bartender's eyes shift, then returned to his glass. "Not drinking," a voice said. Male, young, confident, drunk, but not sloppy. Daniel glanced sideways. The man was grinning, his shirt half unbuttoned, gold chain catching the bar's neon glare. Not the threat, not yet. "I'm fine," Daniel said. "Water's for fish," the man said, laughing. "You a fish?" Daniel didn't answer. The man leaned in closer, the grin faltering at the lack of reaction. Then a hand grabbed the young man's shoulder and yanked him back. "That's enough," said another voice, deeper, heavier, with authority marinated in menace. Daniel turned slightly. The new man was older, maybe late 30s, muscular in the way street brawlers are, thick arms, scarred knuckles, a face half hidden beneath the shadow of a brow too used to frowning. He wore his leather jacket like armor, and his gaze wasn't curious. It was searching, dissecting. "You don't belong here," the man said flatly. Daniel met his gaze. His voice was calm. "Neither does peace." For a moment, neither man moved. The air between them tensed like a wire strung too tight. Around the bar, the mood shifted. Conversations thinned. A few patrons began subtly turning their chairs, eyes drawn by the quiet that often came before something loud. The younger man, now sober enough to sense the danger, backed away. The bartender stood still, rag clenched in hand, not cleaning anymore. No one wanted to be first to speak. But Daniel's words had already spoken for him. Soft, yes, but sharp enough to leave a mark. The older man stepped back, but not in retreat, more like a predator circling. He said nothing, but his glare promised return. As he disappeared into the far shadows of the bar, others turned to watch him go. They knew that kind of man. Raul Mendez, enforcer, cartel muscle dressed in street clothes, known for settling grudges with broken bones and bar stools. Daniel returned to his glass, though he no longer needed a drink. His hand rested on the counter, fingers loose but ready. The moment hadn't passed. It had only begun. Behind him, laughter resumed, but it was thinner now, less honest. The floorboards creaked with new tension. Daniel could feel it, like the buzz of electricity before a storm. He didn't come looking for a fight, but he also didn't run from one. And somewhere in the shadows, Raul Mendez smiled to himself, already planning the next move. The calmest waters often hide the deepest storms. Raul Mendez rose from his stool like a man summoned by something deeper than pride, something territorial, primal. His boots thudded heavily against the warped wooden floor of the rusted anchor as he stalked forward, brushing aside chairs with the arrogance of someone who owned the room. Around him, the low hum of conversation softened, then stilled entirely. All eyes drifted toward the center of the growing tension, though none dared intervene. Raul's fingers flexed at his sides, knuckles cracked and calloused from years of settling things the old way. He stopped just inches from the man who had upset the quiet rhythm of his domain. Daniel Rourke sat alone at the bar, his back straight, his hands resting calmly near a plain glass of water. The contrast was sharp. Raul, wrapped in black leather and sweat, eyes filled with fire. Daniel, in a simple gray shirt stained faintly from travel, his expression unreadable. "You don't belong here," Raul said. His voice was low and gravelly, meant not just for Daniel but for the entire bar to hear. The air around him thickened with unspoken threat. Daniel slowly lifted his head, his gaze steady and level. For a long second, he said nothing. A nearby stool creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. Somewhere behind the bar, a bottle clinked gently as it was set down. "Neither does peace," Daniel replied, his voice calm and deliberate. The words sliced through the space like a blade. Raul's lips curled into a sneer, but his eyes narrowed with something less predictable. Curiosity. He'd expected deflection or fear, not a riddle. Not resistance wrapped in quiet steel. Behind Raul, his companions stirred. One of them, a lanky man with a scar beneath his left eye, leaned toward the others and whispered something with a grin. Another, shorter and thicker with a shaved head, chuckled darkly. Their laughter didn't rise loud, but it spread like smoke, thin, suffocating, and full of intent. Raul raised a hand to silence them. He wasn't finished yet. He leaned closer, just enough for Daniel to catch the sour scent of stale alcohol on his breath. "Is that what you came looking for?" Raul murmured, tapping a thick finger against the bar. "Peace?" Daniel didn't move. His voice was a low murmur, barely audible to anyone not standing inches away. "I came to be left alone." The stillness that followed was unnerving. The regular patrons of the Rusted Anchor, men who worked on loading docks, security gigs, or as muscle for hire, began to lean away from the center of the bar, creating a subtle ring of space. No one said a word, but the message was clear. A line had been drawn. Raul laughed once, short and sharp. Then he glanced back at his crew as if to say, "Watch this." His hand reached for the bottle in front of him, not to drink from it, but to show what it meant to hold something ready. The way he tilted it back and forth, letting the remaining liquor swirl around the base, suggested it could become a weapon at any second. "You see," Raul said, swirling the bottle again, "a man who doesn't drink in a place like this usually means one of two things. Either he's scared of losing control, or he's already too dangerous to need the fire." He let the implication hang there, then tilted the bottle and took a loud sip. Daniel turned his gaze toward the mirror behind the bar. In it, he could see the reflections of Raul's men. 3 seated, one standing by the entrance pretending to check his phone. All of them watching, waiting. "I'm not here to prove anything to anyone," Daniel said, his eyes flicking back to Raul's. "I just want to finish my water and leave." Raul's smile faded. "That's not how things work in San Relvas." Then maybe San Relvas should work differently. That line landed like a slap. One of Raul's men stood abruptly. The bartender, a wiry older man with a nervous twitch in his right eye, tensed as if deciding whether to duck behind the counter. "You got guts," Raul said after a long silence. "I'll give you that." He took a final sip from his bottle, then slammed it upside down on the counter. The impact rattled nearby glasses and made several patrons flinch. The last few drops of liquor spilled onto the bar, pooling slowly toward Daniel's glass. Still, Daniel didn't move. "You think peace belongs in here?" Raoul asked, his tone now mocking. "You bring peace into a war zone. It gets torn to pieces." Daniel finally shifted, just enough to rest one hand loosely on the bar edge. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He didn't need to. His silence was a weapon, heavier than Raoul expected. "I've seen war," Daniel replied, his tone quiet. "This isn't war. This is theater. You want an audience." "I'm not playing." Raoul's jaw twitched. The insult wasn't shouted, it didn't need to be. In a place where men barked to assert dominance, Daniel's refusal to bark made him louder than anyone else in the room. Raoul stepped back half a pace. Then, quick as a viper, he turned to his men and gestured toward Daniel with a flick of the head. "What do you say, boys? Should we help him find the exit?" The group rose one by one. Scar-Eye cracked his knuckles. Shaved Head adjusted his belt. The one by the door slid his phone into his pocket and began moving forward. The bartender moved quietly out of sight. Daniel stayed seated, his mind already calculating distances, angles, and trajectories, old instincts sharpening as if summoned by scent alone. But he waited. Not yet. Raoul leaned forward again, placing his hand flat on the bar beside Daniel's untouched glass. "Last chance, stranger. You can walk out now, or you can crawl out later." Daniel didn't blink. "You're assuming I'll be the one crawling." The muscles in Raoul's jaw clenched. His hand twitched once, involuntarily, a split second before the grin returned to his face. But this time, it didn't reach his eyes. Daniel saw it, the flicker of recognition that he wasn't what Raoul expected. And in that flicker, Daniel saw the future forming. Around them, the bar held its breath. "A storm does not ask permission before it arrives." The bottle shattered with a sickening crack as Raoul Mendez slammed it across Daniel Rourke's head. The sound cut through the murmur of the bar like a gunshot, silencing even the jukebox in the corner. Shards of thick glass splintered in every direction, catching the dim overhead light as they flew. Crimson streaked down Daniel's face immediately, warm blood tracing along the deep gash just above his brow. His body swayed with the force of the blow, and for a moment, just a moment, he seemed human, breakable. A collective gasp swept through the rusted anchor, drawing the eyes of every patron to the sudden eruption of violence. Men froze mid-drink, jaws slack. Others instinctively backed away from their bar stools, the legs scraping sharply against the old floorboards. The room didn't move to stop Raoul, no one ever did, but they all watched, caught in the gravity of what had just been set in motion. Raoul stepped back, his chest rising with the kind of satisfaction only bullies knew. The jagged neck of the broken bottle was still in his hand, trembling slightly from the force of the strike. He tilted his head, studying Daniel's reaction like a child poking at a trapped animal, waiting for it to squeal. Raoul's smirk widened, revealing yellowed teeth beneath a cracked lip. "Didn't expect that, did you?" he muttered, his voice dripping with mockery and pride. But Daniel didn't fall. He didn't cry out, didn't reach for the wound, didn't even flinch. Instead, he lifted his head slowly, the blood now running down both sides of his face, mixing with sweat and dust. His eyes, though rimmed with pain, held something sharper than rage, clarity, steely, still, and burning cold, the kind of look that didn't belong in a neighborhood bar, but on a battlefield. Raoul's grin faltered. It was subtle, but it happened. A muscle near his jaw twitched. The men behind him, his usual pack of thugs who had been laughing moments ago, suddenly fell quiet. They watched Daniel with growing unease, as if some ancient instinct was warning them that they'd awoken something best left buried. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was a roar beneath the chaos, louder than the laughter that had preceded the blow. He reached up, slowly and deliberately, and wiped the blood from his right eye with the sleeve of his shirt. The fabric soaked red, but his gaze remained locked on Raoul, unwavering, unforgiving. One of Raoul's companions, a younger man with a shaved head and a nervous twitch in his hands, whispered, "Raoul, maybe he's not just some drifter." His voice barely reached over the growing hum of tension. Raoul ignored him, stepping forward with renewed arrogance. "You gonna cry now, hero? That all it takes to send you crawling?" His voice was louder now, theatrical. He needed the room to believe he was still in control. Daniel blinked slowly. He tasted iron in his mouth but felt no fear. just calculation. He knew this kind of man, Raul Mendez, the type who confused fear with respect and violence with power. Daniel had met men like him in bombed-out villages and cartel-run slums. He had left most of them lying on the ground. He hadn't come to the Rusted Anchor looking for trouble, but now trouble had carved its name into his forehead. He let out a slow, steady breath, grounding himself. The pain was sharp, but familiar. Pain had been a teacher once, and tonight it would be his ally. Raul stepped closer again, bottle hilt still in hand. "That's what I thought," he muttered. "Just another quiet little—" Daniel moved. It wasn't dramatic or loud, no shouted warning, no flashy stance, just a subtle shift of the feet, a tightening of the shoulders, like a lever pulled in a machine no one saw coming. His eyes never left Raul's, and still he did not strike. Not yet. The patrons, caught in the current of the moment, leaned forward unconsciously. The bartender crouched behind the bar, barely breathing. A couple of off-duty security guards near the corner whispered amongst themselves, debating whether to intervene or stay low. Raul's confidence began to bleed into something else. He glanced to the side, uncertain. "You've got nothing to say?" he sneered, louder now for the crowd. "You think staring at me is going to save you?" Daniel's lips parted, not in a smile but in something colder. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," he said quietly. Raul snorted, but it sounded forced. "Yeah? You going to scare me with words now?" Daniel's voice remained steady, low like thunder still forming in the clouds. "No, I'm going to show you." The room exhaled as if it had been holding its breath. The bottle in Raul's hand suddenly didn't feel so powerful. His fingers tightened around it, unsure whether to strike again or step back. That hesitation, just a flicker of it, was all Daniel needed to read. He had seen it before in war zones, just before a man's confidence gave way to collapse. Behind Raul, his men no longer looked eager. One leaned slightly toward the door, another reached subtly toward his belt, where a knife handle poked out beneath his jacket. But none of them moved. The air felt thicker now, like the very walls were waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel straightened his back fully, the blood now pooling on his collarbone, warm and sticky. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need one. The scars along his knuckles told stories louder than any threat could. Raul didn't understand what had shifted, only that it had. He'd come looking for a reaction. He had found something else entirely, something trained, tempered, and terrifying. And in that suspended moment, before the next blow, before the room turned from quiet to chaos, Raul smiled again. But this time, it didn't reach his eyes. Sometimes the crack of glass is the opening note of a war. The glass bottle shattered against Daniel's head with a vicious crack, its jagged edge ripping through skin and bone. Blood sprayed across the counter, speckling nearby glasses and leaving crimson streaks on the dark wood. The sound hung in the air, raw and final, like a judge's gavel in a trial where no defense was allowed. Gasps escaped from the crowd like steam from a broken pipe, followed by a silence so heavy it pressed on every chest in the room. Raul Mendez stepped back, grinning wide, the remains of the broken bottle still clutched in his fist. His chest rose and fell with the satisfaction of a man who believed the fight had ended before it began. He turned his head slightly, inviting the others to share in his dominance. But no one laughed. No one clapped. Their eyes weren't on him. Daniel didn't fall. Instead, slowly, impossibly, he straightened, his movements deliberate, as though his very bones had chosen defiance over collapse. Blood dripped steadily from his scalp, tracing thick crimson lines down his face like tribal paint worn by warriors long forgotten. One streak crossed his brow, another curved past the side of his nose, gathering at the corner of his mouth where he tasted iron and memory. A stool creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. A glass rolled off a nearby table and shattered on the floor, unnoticed. Daniel raised one hand, wiped the blood from his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket, and dropped the arm to his side. The room shrank around him. Or maybe it was just the way he stood, shoulders square, chest rising slowly, his presence expanding like a tide refusing to be turned back. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every man in the Rusted Anchor could feel it. The shift in the air, the drop in temperature, the weight of an unspoken truth pressing down on them all. Raul's grin twitched at the corner. His eyes narrowed. "You should have stayed down," Raul muttered, trying to sound amused. But there was a tremor in his voice, barely there, but real. Daniel tilted his head, almost curious. Then, with slow precision, he reached up with his left hand and curled his fingers around a piece of glass still lodged in the side of his temple. It was a small shard, no bigger than a key, but it glinted in the bar's dim light like something sacred. He didn't flinch as he pulled it free. Blood gushed down his cheek, but his expression didn't change. He held the glass between his thumb and forefinger, then let it fall to the floor with a soft clink. The sound was minor, but in the tense silence, it was thunder. Raoul's men shifted behind him, their bravado beginning to flicker. One of them, a younger guy with a scar down his neck, stepped back instinctively, bumping into a bar stool. Daniel took a step forward. That single step was enough. He didn't lunge, he didn't snarl or threaten. He simply moved, and with that motion, something in the crowd cracked. The illusion of Raoul's control had been pierced, not by fury, but by calm. Cold, terrifying calm. Miguel, the bartender, ducked behind the counter, whispering something to himself as he reached for the baseball bat he kept under the bar. A few patrons slid toward the exits, unsure whether to flee or stay and witness something that already felt like legend in the making. "He's not just some guy," one man whispered near the corner. Another leaned in. "I've seen him before." Or someone like him. Afghanistan. Or was it Fallujah? "Doesn't matter," the first replied, eyes wide. "He's not here to lose." Raoul's men heard the murmurs, and for the first time their confidence wavered. But Raoul refused to see it. "All this because you didn't want a drink?" he said, trying to reclaim control. "You think blood makes you brave?" Daniel's eyes, blood-rimmed but steady, locked with his. "No," he replied, voice low and steady. "It makes me ready." The words hit harder than any punch could. They weren't loud, they weren't shouted, but they carried weight, like stone dropped into still water. Raoul's bravado cracked again, a subtle twitch in his jaw giving him away. He tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat. Daniel took another step forward. The room itself seemed to lean with him, pulled into his orbit. He clenched his fists, not in rage, but in preparation. His knuckles whitened, his shoulders relaxed. Every movement spoke of training, of battles that didn't happen under bar lights but under the burning sun of war zones where death whispered close and loud. Behind Raoul, his men started to break. Some turned their eyes to the door. Others looked to Raoul for leadership, only to find a man unraveling, a predator who had found himself staring into something far more dangerous than prey. Daniel stepped forward again until he was only a breath away. The flicker of challenge in Raoul's eyes vanished, replaced by something else, something ancient. Fear. It crawled up his spine in cold tremors, the same fear every man feels when instinct tells him he's misjudged the moment, and the cost might be everything. Daniel didn't hit him. Not yet. He just stared, his face smeared in blood, jaw set, his silence a declaration. And in that silence the patrons began to understand. He wasn't here by accident. He wasn't just another traveler. He was the kind of man stories were written about long after the dust settled. What Raoul had mistaken for weakness was restraint, and what Raoul had awakened was something he could never put back to sleep. Blood on the floor is not always the end. It can be the beginning. The first punch Daniel threw landed with devastating precision. Raoul's head snapped back as his body was lifted off his feet and sent crashing into a table behind him. Glass shattered, chairs flipped, and startled patrons leapt from their seats. One man fell backward, spilling his drink across the floor as the entire bar seemed to lurch in the shockwave. Raoul groaned from the floor, clutching his chest, his breath rattling like loose bolts in an engine. His men, huddled around the outskirts moments ago, snapped into motion. The game had begun. A thick-set man with a shaved head grabbed a pool cue and charged. He raised it high like a sword, but Daniel ducked under the swing just in time. The cue missed by inches and struck a hanging light fixture, sending sparks across the ceiling. Daniel surged upward, his elbow driving deep into the attacker's ribs. The crack of bone silenced the man's breath. He dropped the cue and collapsed to the floor, writhing. Another came from behind, lean and wiry, trying to catch Daniel off guard. Daniel sensed the movement, pivoting swiftly. His hand gripped the attacker's wrist while his hip dropped low, and with a practiced twist, he flipped the man over his shoulder. The attacker hit the floorboards with a grunt, the impact shaking the wooden foundation so hard that dust drifted down from the rafters. Chaos took over. The rusted anchor, once buzzing with whispers and wary glances, transformed into a storm of flying fists and collapsing tables. The jukebox in the corner screeched to a halt as someone crashed into it. Patrons screamed, pushing toward the exits, while others, drawn by the spectacle, clung to the walls, eyes wide, beers forgotten. Behind the counter, the bartender ducked. "Get down," he shouted, his voice cracking as another glass shattered nearby. He fumbled with his phone but dropped it when a bar stool flew across the room, missing him by inches. Daniel moved through it all with surgical calm. His breathing was steady, his eyes alert, even as blood streaked down from the wound Raoul had opened on his forehead. Every movement was deliberate. He blocked one swing with a forearm, grabbed a man's shirt, and drove a knee into his stomach. Another opponent tried to bear hug him from the side, but Daniel slammed his foot down onto the man's instep and drove an elbow into his temple. "Who is this guy?" someone shouted, voice trembling. No one answered. Raoul was back on his feet now, jaw clenched, face red with fury. He grabbed a bottle from the counter, smashed its neck against the edge, and pointed the jagged edge toward Daniel like a sword. Blood trickled from his lip, but his eyes burned with vengeance. Daniel didn't flinch. His gaze swept the room, assessing. Every sound was processed, footsteps behind him, glass under boots, the creak of the bar's aging beams. He sidestepped an attack and shoved another man head-first into a pillar. Raoul roared, charging again. His swing came fast, but Daniel deflected it, grabbing Raoul's wrist mid-strike. The glass scraped his forearm, but he didn't release. With a snap of his shoulder, he redirected Raoul's momentum and drove him backward into the bar, knocking several glasses onto the floor. "I'm not done," Raoul spat, wiping blood from his cheek. Daniel's voice was quiet but unshakable. "Neither am I." Raoul's remaining men hesitated. Their earlier confidence now wavered as they saw their strongest struggling. Two more lunged at Daniel in tandem, one high, one low. Daniel stepped into them instead of away. He kneed the first in the gut, twisted the second's arm, and drove him head-first into a support beam. The crunch of contact echoed like a warning bell. The floor was littered with bodies, some unconscious, others groaning, crawling for cover. The smell of sweat and blood mixed with spilled whiskey. Splinters from broken chairs poked up like thorns from the battlefield. Still, Daniel moved like a shadow with muscle, his bloodied face unreadable. Raoul pulled himself up again, fury in his eyes. He tried to rally his crew, barking orders. "Get him! All of you! Now!" But the fear was creeping in. One of the younger men took a step forward, then paused, eyeing the wreckage around him. Another backed away, breathing heavily. Daniel didn't slow. He ducked a wild punch, swept a man's legs out from under him, then pivoted to catch Raoul's next charge. The two men collided, fists flying. Raoul landed a glancing blow to Daniel's shoulder, but Daniel retaliated with a palm strike to the chest that sent the enforcer stumbling. The patrons who hadn't fled stood frozen, watching a war unfold. To them, it no longer felt like a bar fight. It was something deeper, something unspoken. The precision, the power, the unyielding control Daniel showed wasn't just self-defense. It was a lesson. Raoul tried to speak again, to taunt, to claim control, but his voice cracked and Daniel was already moving. He grabbed Raoul by the collar and flung him over a toppled chair, then turned to the last man who dared step forward. The man froze mid-lunge and slowly backed away, hands raised. Glass crunched beneath Daniel's boots as he stood tall in the center of the destruction. His chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. Around him, the bar was in ruins, tables overturned, walls dented, silence gripping the air like smoke after a blaze. And still, his eyes were calm. This wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge, it was proof. Some men fight to win. Others fight to end all doubt. Raoul's men surged toward Daniel like a wave with no intention of breaking. 4 of them grabbed his arms and shoulders, yanking him toward the center of the ruined bar. Their grip was tight, their intent clear: overpower him, beat him into submission, remind the crowd that Raoul Mendez's words still ruled San Relvas. But Daniel wasn't thinking about Raoul's pride. He was thinking about his footing. As they dragged him across the slick, whiskey-soaked floor, Daniel adjusted his weight. The second his boots hit firm ground between the tables, he shifted. He dropped his center of gravity, letting his body go heavy and dead weight. One man stumbled, and in that breath of imbalance Daniel exploded upward with violent purpose. His leg swept hard across the back of a captor's knee, sending him crashing backward into a broken stool. The other 3 barely had time to react before Daniel rammed his shoulder into the gut of the nearest one, lifting and throwing him with practiced ease into a cluster of chairs. A chorus of gasps rippled through the crowd. Bottles dropped, chairs scraped. The room lit up with motion. One of Raoul's men, a younger one with a scar across his lip, charged with a jagged chair leg, shouting something guttural. Daniel turned just in time. He ducked low, the makeshift weapon slicing the air above his head, and drove his elbow into the attacker's stomach. The man bent forward with a gasp. Daniel grabbed the back of his neck and slammed his head down onto a nearby table. Wood cracked. The man didn't rise again. The rusted anchor, once a place of whispered threats and heavy glances, was now fully alive with chaos. Spectators scrambled back or ducked behind booths, yet some remained frozen, entranced by the unfolding scene. One bartender, crouched behind the counter, whispered a prayer into his trembling hands. Daniel's blood was hot and rushing, but his mind remained steady. His body was a map of scars, each one a lesson in timing, angles, and limits. The ache in his ribs from earlier strikes only reminded him to breathe smart, to move sharp. Every broken bottle or fallen beam on the floor became a potential weapon, and he used them all. He grabbed a stool and spun it in a wide arc, catching two of Raoul's men in the legs, sending them sprawling. From the side, another attacker rushed in with a pool cue, swinging like a man trying to prove something. Daniel caught it mid-swing, twisted it from the man's hands, and broke it clean across his attacker's back with a snap that echoed off the walls. The man dropped like a rag doll, groaning. Blood smeared the floor like ink from a spilled secret. The room stank of sweat, alcohol, and fear. Daniel's breathing was shallow but deliberate. His arm burned where the glass had cut him earlier, but he couldn't look down. Not now. Another man came from the right, slashing wildly with a broken shard. Daniel's reflexes kicked in. He leaned back just enough for the glass to whistle past his cheek, then slammed his forehead into the attacker's face with a thud that sent the man stumbling. Eyes rolled back. Then Raoul entered again. His eyes were wild now, not amused, not entertained, but rattled. The false confidence had slipped, replaced by something closer to fury tinged with desperation. He shouted across the chaos, "Back him into the corner!" Now. But no one moved. Some of his men hesitated, a few already down, others bleeding or limping. So Raoul drew the knife himself. Its curved blade shimmered under the bar's failing lights, stained with past deeds. He held it low, shoulders hunched, and pushed forward. Patrons held their breath as he lunged, the steel aimed at Daniel's ribs. Daniel stepped aside. He caught Raoul's wrist mid-thrust and twisted, hard. The knife clattered to the floor, spinning to a stop against a broken leg of a bar stool. Daniel didn't hesitate. His other hand came up and gripped the back of Raoul's neck. With force born from muscle memory and fury long buried, he drove Raoul's head forward, straight into the edge of the counter. Wood split. Raoul's body dropped. Gasps filled the room. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the flickering overhead light seemed to pause. Raoul groaned, struggling to push himself up with one hand, the other cradling his bleeding forehead. Daniel stood over him, his breath steady, his eyes cold. And still, the others came. One man, tall, shirt torn, dragging a limp leg, charged anyway, fueled by loyalty or fear. Daniel grabbed a fallen pipe and swung it in a tight arc across the man's side, knocking the wind from his lungs. Another tried to tackle him from behind but was caught mid-motion, flipped over Daniel's back and slammed onto the floor with a crack that might have been ribs. They weren't fighting for Raoul now. They were fighting not to be seen hesitating. They were fighting for their own survival inside the cartel machine. But Daniel was fighting for something deeper. Not vengeance, not dominance. He was fighting to remind himself, and this broken room, what it meant to not run anymore. He stood among the wreckage, blood on his face, cuts lining his arms, muscles screaming with each movement. Around him, the floor was littered with groaning bodies, smashed glass, and the moans of men who thought they'd never meet someone like him. And still, he stood. The bartender peeked over the counter, eyes wide. One drunk in the corner muttered, "He's not real." Daniel ignored them all. His gaze remained locked on Raoul, who now crawled backward, legs unsteady, face painted red and trembling. The fight wasn't over, but Raoul's pride was. The remaining men, sensing the tide had turned, hesitated. Some backed away, others dropped their makeshift weapons entirely, and as the room breathed again, full of the scent of sweat, metal, and whiskey, Daniel took one long breath and braced himself, because he knew this wasn't the end. More would come. The cost of what he just did hadn't been paid yet. But for now, in the ruins of the rusted anchor, Daniel Rourke had made a statement no one could forget. When chaos swallows a room, discipline becomes the sharpest blade. The floor gave way with a thunderous crack. One moment, Daniel had momentum. The next, everything was falling. The wooden boards beneath his boots split like brittle bones, screams rising as a dozen bodies plummeted through the collapsing foundation of the rusted anchor. Dust exploded into the air like a wave of ash. The crash was deafening. Tables, chairs, and men tumbling in chaos as the ground swallowed them whole. Daniel hit the basement floor hard, ribs jolting from the impact, but he rolled instinctively, landing in a crouch just as a broken beam slammed into the ground where his head had been a second earlier. Around him, Raoul's men groaned, scattered in heaps of limbs and pain. Dust filled his lungs, stung his eyes, turned breath into choking gasps. The only light came from a single flickering bulb that swung on a frayed wire above, casting jerky shadows across the ruined basement like a failing heartbeat. A few feet away, Raoul emerged from the wreckage. He rose slowly, like something ancient climbing out of a grave, face streaked with blood, shoulders heaving. He looked less like a man now, and more like an animal cornered by the collapse of his own arrogance. A low growl rose from his throat as he reached into the debris and yanked free a rusted iron pipe, its ends jagged with corrosion. "You think this is over?" Raoul hissed, the pipe dragging against the concrete with a metallic scrape. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with hatred boiling over. "I'm not done with you." Daniel didn't answer. He stood, blood trickling from the gash above his eye, dripping onto his chest, already stiffening with dried sweat and grime. He adjusted his stance, knees bent, hands loose but ready. His mind was calm, but his body thrummed with pain. His left shoulder ached, the muscles strained. There was a slice along his forearm, shallow but bleeding steadily. Still, his breathing remained controlled. It had to be. The basement was narrow, boxed in by stone and decay, old storage racks leaning at crooked angles, broken crates spilling rotted cloth and rusted tools. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was a cage, no exits, no crowd to separate them, no noise to distract. Just two men surrounded by silence and pain, inches from each other and light years apart in discipline. Raoul charged. The pipe sliced through the air in a wide arc. Daniel ducked low, the wind from the swing brushing his temple. He stepped in, striking Raoul's ribs with a quick jab, then pivoted away before the next swing came. The pipe hit a wall, sparks flying as it connected with exposed rebar. Raoul didn't care. He roared and swung again. Each clash was closer than the last. Metal against concrete. Fists against flesh. Grunts filled the air, echoing off the tight stone walls. Daniel moved with practiced control, letting instinct guide him. He absorbed a blow to the side, grunted in pain, then responded with a palm strike that snapped Raoul's head back. Blood flew from the enforcer's mouth, spattering the ground. Two of Raoul's men stirred behind the crates, one crawling toward a piece of wood like he meant to join in. Daniel didn't take his eyes off Raoul, but his voice cut through the air like a command. "Don't." The man froze. The others, still groaning, didn't dare move. Raoul wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You think you scare them?" he spat. "You think beating me changes anything?" Daniel's chest rose and fell steadily. "I don't care what it changes. I'm not here for them." He was here for the message, for the line drawn in blood and grit, for every time Raoul had walked into a room and made men kneel. Tonight, Daniel stood tall, not for pride, not for glory, but because men like Raoul thrived in silence, and Daniel had come to break that silence. Raoul came again, pipe raised. Daniel sidestepped, caught his wrist, and twisted. The pipe clanged to the floor. With a quick elbow to the throat, Raoul staggered backward, coughing violently. Daniel didn't wait. He closed the distance and drove a knee into Raoul's gut, then followed with a punch so sharp it echoed like a gunshot. Raoul collapsed against the far wall, sliding down in a heap, legs folding under him. For a moment, the only sound was the dripping of blood onto concrete. Daniel stood still, his breath slowing. Around him, the broken men remained quiet. Some stared with wide eyes. Others closed theirs in fear or disbelief. Raoul coughed again, trying to rise. His hands slipped in his own blood. Daniel stepped forward, grabbed him by the collar, and pulled him upright. Their faces were inches apart. Raoul's eyes, once filled with fire, now flickered with something closer to dread. "You don't understand," Raoul gasped. "The cartel, they'll come for you." Daniel's voice was low, steady. "Let them." Raoul's lips parted like he might protest, but Daniel slammed him against the wall, not to hurt him, but to make him listen. "This was never about me and you. This is about everyone you've hurt because they couldn't fight back." Raoul's chest heaved. The fear in his eyes deepened, and in that moment the others realized Raoul Mendez, the feared enforcer, was losing. Not just the fight, but everything he had built his identity upon. Daniel let go. Raoul dropped to the ground like a discarded weapon. He didn't rise again. Daniel looked around. Every man in that basement had seen it, had felt it, and none of them would forget. He wiped more blood from his face and turned to the staircase half buried in rubble. Behind him, no one moved. No one dared, because the ground had collapsed, but something far stronger had risen from its ruins. When the ground falls, the truth of a man rises. He thought his cartel power would silence the room, but justice doesn't stay quiet. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The pipe came down fast, slicing the air with a violent whistle, missing Daniel's head by inches and smashing sparks off the concrete wall. He ducked low, the stale basement air brushing his skin as he shifted left, eyes tracking Raoul's next move. The pipe clanged against stone again, this time rebounding awkwardly off a support beam. Raoul grunted, frustration mixing with the smell of rust and blood. Daniel stayed close to the wall, narrowing the space between them. Down here, movement was restricted. The ceilings hung low, and every sound multiplied, the sharp hiss of breath, the scrape of boots, the wet drip of blood from his brow. Glass fragments embedded in his scalp sent throbs of pain through his skull, but Daniel didn't flinch. Pain was an old companion. Familiar. Manageable. Raoul came again, teeth bared like a rabid dog, swinging high and wide with both hands. The pipe arced toward Daniel's side, but Daniel pivoted on the balls of his feet, slipping inside the strike zone. With surgical precision, he trapped Raoul's swinging arm under his own, twisting it sharply until the pipe clattered to the ground with a metallic thud. Raoul roared in pain, his knees buckling. Daniel didn't hesitate. He drove an elbow into Raoul's ribs, once, twice, then followed with a crushing jab to the throat. Raoul staggered back, coughing and wheezing, but still full of venom. He lunged forward, fists flailing in wild, angry hooks, more rage than strategy. Daniel absorbed one blow to his shoulder, another to his ribs. The hits hurt, but not enough to stop him. He had taken worse. Much worse. The tightness of the basement magnified every movement. There was no room for theatrics here, just survival. The single bulb flickered above, casting stuttering shadows across the damp floor. Broken beams leaned against the walls like fallen spears, and dust hovered in the air like fog, stirred by the violence of the collapse. Around them, Raoul's men stirred. Some were half-conscious, crawling across broken floorboards and hunks of stone. One tried to rise, but collapsed again, groaning. Another leaned against a pillar, blood streaming from his temple, watching the brawl with haunted eyes. No one interfered. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't dare. Something about Daniel's silence unnerved them more than Raoul's fury ever had. Daniel kept moving, weaving through Raoul's strikes, countering with crisp, brutal efficiency. A palm strike to the nose, a knee to the thigh, a sharp hook to the liver. Raoul's body began to betray him, slowing, trembling, stumbling. Yet still he fought, cursing between gasps, his pride refusing to bow. "You think this ends with me?" Raoul spat blood onto the floor, voice cracking. "The cartel will come. They'll come for you." Daniel didn't respond at first. He circled Raoul slowly, not like a predator, but like a man reading the wind before a final step. The words weren't necessary. The look in his eyes said enough. But still, he spoke, low and steady, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I've stood against worse," Raoul charged, reckless, wounded, desperate. Daniel didn't back away. He stepped into the charge, raised his arm and unleashed a strike so precise, so devastating that it stopped Raoul mid-motion. A heavy right, perfectly placed, crashed into Raoul's jaw, twisting his head violently to the side. The enforcer dropped to his knees, mouth open, eyes dazed. The silence that followed was total. Even the flickering bulb seemed to pause. Raoul swayed slightly, then collapsed forward, his palms smacking against the dirt-caked ground. Daniel stood over him, chest rising with each slow breath, blood trailing down from his temple and across his throat. Behind him, one of the cartel men whispered something inaudible, the kind of prayer only fear can create. Daniel didn't look back. He stared down at Raoul's broken body, not with triumph, but with the weight of necessity. He had never wanted this. He had come here to disappear, to find peace. But some storms don't ask for permission. One of the younger cartel men, still kneeling beside the wall, stared up at him and whispered, "What are you?" Daniel turned slightly, just enough to meet his eyes, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. In the dark, only those who carry their own fire endure. Raoul crashed against the basement wall with a sickening thud, dust shaking loose from the stone and trickling down in a slow, choking mist. Daniel's grip on Raoul's collar was ironclad, unwavering, his knuckles white from pressure and blood, some his own, some not. The pipe Raoul had once swung now lay forgotten beneath a pile of broken wood and bodies, a relic of a fight that was no longer his to win. Raoul wheezed, blood dripping from his cracked lips, the weight of failure beginning to sink into his bones like cold rain. Daniel's eyes burned with focus, his face painted in streaks of crimson and dirt, his chest heaving with exhaustion, not from weakness, but from sheer output. Every motion until now had been necessity wrapped in silence. But now, standing there, with Raoul pinned between his grip and the hard wall behind him, Daniel allowed a flicker of presence to rise, something unspoken that still thundered louder than any battle cry. "You think this is just about muscle?" Daniel said, voice low, almost conversational. "You think I bleed and quit like the rest?" Raoul tried to respond but coughed instead, a spray of red splattering Daniel's torn shirt. His legs kicked once, twice, searching for solid footing, but there was none. The foundation beneath him, literal and metaphorical, had shattered. His men, once a wall of menace, now sat or lay slumped along the basement floor. Some groaned, others clutched ribs or arms, but none dared move toward their fallen leader. The sounds of the earlier chaos had thinned into a grim silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a rusted pipe above and the labored breaths of those still conscious. "You're not Cartel," Raoul spat finally, his voice hoarse with disbelief and pain. "You're something else." Daniel said nothing for a moment. Instead, he studied Raoul's face, the swelling around his eye, the fear now carving into his once proud expression. This was the man who had ruled San Relvas through brutality and fear, and yet in this moment he looked no more powerful than a schoolyard bully whose threats had finally failed him. From the shadows, one of Raoul's men shifted uneasily, whispering to another. The words carried just far enough. "He's not just a fighter. He's military." Maybe a SEAL. The air in the basement shifted. That word, SEAL, was more than a title. It was a warning, a history of ghosts in deserts and jungles, of men trained not just to fight, but to survive and dismantle. One by one, the eyes of the survivors widened as recognition sparked, flickers of memory piecing together tales they had heard in hushed voices about men who moved without sound, killed without hesitation, and vanished before sunrise. Daniel leaned closer to Raoul, enough that their faces were inches apart. His voice was barely above a whisper now, but the intensity behind it cut through the air like steel. "You sent 10 men after one. They had pipes, knives, numbers. I had purpose," he said, "and I warned you, peace doesn't live here anymore." Raoul's bravado began to melt entirely. His fingers curled into fists, but it was habit, not hope. The strength was gone. The dominance had bled out through a dozen cracks in his ribs and the growing bruise swelling beneath his jaw. "I'll come back," Raoul growled weakly. "You think this changes anything?" Daniel released him with a suddenness that caught even Raoul off guard. The enforcer dropped to the floor like a felled tree, landing hard on his side with a grunt. Daniel took one step back, standing tall and steady despite the blood caking his temple and the sting in his shoulder. "You won't," Daniel said, "because now you know what waits." He turned, eyes sweeping the room, not to gloat, but to observe. Each man lowered his gaze. No one reached for a weapon. The fire in their eyes had gone out, replaced by a bone-deep understanding that this was no ordinary man. Without warning or flourish, Daniel moved toward the narrow stairwell that led back to the broken floor above. His boot falls were deliberate, unhurried. Raoul remained on the ground, propped against the wall, breathing in short, sharp bursts as if afraid to inhale too deeply around the truth now crushing him. None followed Daniel. None dared. The cartel enforcer's legend had died in that basement, stripped down and discarded like the rusted pipe he once wielded with pride. And in its place rose a new legend, one whispered in uncertainty, fear, and respect. At the top of the stairs, Daniel paused only once, glancing back into the dim glow of the basement. His voice came one last time, calm and firm. Sometimes the loudest truth is spoken without raising your voice. Blood still stained the floorboards when the first whispers began. By the time dawn broke over San Relvas, the city was alive with rumor. Word of the fight at Rusted Anchor had traveled through alleys, across rooftops, into cartel safehouses and street corner dens. They all spoke of the man with the scarred face who didn't flinch when glass opened his skull. The man who stood through the storm and sent Raul Mendez, the cartel's enforcer, the breaker of bones, crashing into ruin. Inside the bar, the damage spoke louder than any voice. Chairs splintered like bones. Tables reduced to firewood. The floor, once solid, now a gaping wound exposing the cracked foundation below. The bartender, Miguel Vargas, stood in the wreckage, broom in hand but too stunned to use it. His eyes scanned the room as if trying to piece together the moment it all unraveled. Outside, Raul's men moved quickly, hauling their broken leader into the back of a dusty black truck before the sun's rays touched the street. Raul's face was a swollen map of pain. One eye closed, blood matting his hair, jaw clenched not in strength but in shame. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His pride had been beaten down to whispers, and in cartel culture, a whisper of weakness could be a death sentence. The truck sped off toward the hills, where the cartel's upper ranks waited, fuming. Behind them, silence settled like dust over the bar. But it didn't last. Daniel Rourke emerged from the shadows behind the alley, his steps measured, his breath slow and controlled. He had circled around once the fight ended, avoiding the crowd, watching from the dark. The adrenaline had faded, and pain now took its place. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandage around his head, just a torn sleeve tied tightly, the knot stained deep crimson. His knuckles were raw, his muscles aching, but his mind was alert. He leaned briefly against the cold brick wall of the bar's outer wall, steadying himself. The sounds of morning crept in, distant vendors setting up stalls, a boy yelling about newspapers, a dog barking 2 streets over. Normalcy. The kind that came too easily to those who hadn't seen what collapsed just hours before. Daniel moved again, slipping through side streets. He didn't run. Running would attract attention. He walked with the weight of someone who knew he was being watched, even if the eyes hadn't revealed themselves yet. His instincts, honed through years in terrain far more hostile than this, warned him. The cartel wouldn't let this stand. In the slums to the west, men were already speaking his name, though none knew it. They called him El Fantasma, the ghost. Others whispered that Raul had picked a fight with a military man, someone trained not to brawl, but to end lives. Rumors painted him taller than he was, faster than the eye, bulletproof. But Daniel knew better. He bled like any man. He just didn't break. He found a quiet place behind a shuttered storefront and tended to his wounds with a bottle of liquor and a torn napkin. The sting of alcohol lit his nerves on fire, but he didn't flinch. He worked with grim determination, pressing cloth against the deepest gash and checking the swelling around his ribs. Nothing broken, bruised maybe, but he'd fought through worse. He'd been trained not to panic in pain, but to think through it. As he leaned back, letting the sunrise warm his face, a flicker of doubt entered his mind. He hadn't come to San Relvas for this. He wanted silence, rest, to let the shadows of his past fade in the noise of a city already loud with its own sins. But the bottle Raul smashed over his head had done more than draw blood. It had shattered that plan. The fight, as brutal as it was, wasn't the end. Not here, not in a city that answered to fear. He looked down at his hands, still steady, still lethal. They'll come for me, he thought. Not Raul, he's finished, but the ones above him. They'll see my name as a stain on their pride, and stains, in their world, were scrubbed clean with bullets. A low voice startled him. "You shouldn't be walking," said a man, middle-aged, narrow face, cigarette tucked behind his ear. He leaned against the wall beside the alley's entrance, arms crossed. "They're already looking for you." Word is, the bosses aren't happy. Daniel didn't ask who he was. It didn't matter. Information in cities like San Relvas came from the mouths of ghosts, men who didn't exist on paper but always knew what burned beneath the surface. Then let them look, Daniel said, tightening the knot on his bandage. His voice was calm, like water held still by stone. I didn't start this. The man gave a half shrug. They don't care who started it. Only that Raoul lost, Daniel stood. His eyes met the man's, not with threat, but with certainty. Then they'll learn what Raoul did too late. The man didn't reply. He just nodded once and disappeared into the morning. Daniel continued down the alley, slipping into the crowd of market-goers as if he were just another man shopping for fruit. He moved with care now, eyes scanning reflections in windows, watching for cars that idled too long, for men who wore jackets despite the heat. He had made a choice by standing his ground. Now he had to live with it. The rumors were already changing. Some said he was a mercenary sent to test the cartel's strength. Others said he was a ghost of someone Raoul had wronged, come back to collect. But the truth was simpler, more dangerous. He was just a man who refused to kneel. By late afternoon, news had reached the cartel's hillside compound. Men with gold rings and blood-stained hands pounded tables, demanding explanations. One slammed a fist against a cracked leather chair and barked orders to find the stranger, dead or alive. Raoul's face on the security camera feeds was replayed again and again. His swollen eye, his limp body. The enforcer who once made men tremble had been carried out like broken cargo. Humiliation echoed louder than screams, and humiliation demanded revenge. But Daniel didn't hide. That night, as the sun dipped and the city buzzed with its usual blend of laughter and sirens, he walked the main road like he belonged there. Because in a way, he did now. He had drawn blood on the floor of San Relvas and bled into its soil. He was part of its story. He passed a pair of teenagers sitting on a stoop, one whispering to the other as he passed. That's him. The guy who broke Raoul Daniel didn't turn, didn't slow. He kept walking, eyes forward, heart steady. In the distance, he could already hear the engines of men coming to restore fear to the streets. But fear, he knew, only worked on those who had something to lose. Daniel Rourke had already lost peace. Now he would fight for what remained. The fight was not over. It had only shifted to daylight. Daniel stepped over the shattered wood and dust of what had once been the rusted anchor's floor. Moonlight slipped through the holes in the broken ceiling, casting long shadows across the wreckage. Tables lay upturned, glass crunched beneath his boots, and the scent of charred wood mixed with dried blood lingered in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. Miguel Vargas stood behind the half-collapsed counter, sweeping debris into a pile with slow, deliberate strokes. His sleeves were rolled up, hands dirtied with soot, and his eyes, sunken with sleepless nights, brightened faintly at the sight of Daniel. "I didn't think you'd come back," Miguel said quietly, setting the broom aside. His voice carried the weight of fear and gratitude, two emotions San Relvas knew too well. Daniel nodded once. "Had to see it for myself." Miguel walked around the bar, limping slightly from an old injury. "You did something here, Rourke." "Something big." "Raoul, he used to sit in that corner." He pointed toward a cracked beam. "And nobody dared speak unless he allowed it. I paid him every week. Not for protection, just for silence." He lowered his voice, glancing at the windows as if expecting Raoul's ghost to return. "But when you stood up, you broke something. Not just him." Daniel scanned the room. "Freedom comes with a cost," Miguel sighed. "They're looking for you." Cartel SUVs, slow passes down the block, different plates. Same eyes, Daniel didn't flinch. "I know." "You're not hiding, are you?" Miguel asked, though the answer already lived in Daniel's stance. "No. I'm preparing." That night, Daniel moved like a shadow through the city. The old instincts returned as naturally as breath. He mapped every alley from the rusted anchor to the docks, noting every blind corner, rooftop access point, and dead-end trap. He climbed rusted ladders onto roofs and watched the patterns of passing headlights. Dogs barked in the distance, sirens wailed faintly, and the city murmured with secrets it refused to share. At one corner, he paused, crouched behind a dumpster as a black SUV idled at the curb. Two men leaned against the hood, smoking in silence. Their tattoos, the way they scanned the windows, Daniel recognized the language of killers. They were not looking for a fight. They were waiting for an execution. He circled back, heart steady, mind sharpening. He marked their faces. They would be the first to move when Raoul gave the order. Inside a dim room above a closed pawnshop, Daniel laid out a crude map on a wooden table. He used chalk to mark key points, intersections, rooftops with clear lines of sight, alley bottlenecks. Each move had to be deliberate. Each step had to matter. The days of running were over. Now came the stand. Miguel visited him briefly, bringing bandages and 2 rolls of gauze. "You're really going to fight them?" he asked, setting the supplies down. Daniel looked up. "They need to know there's a line they can't cross." Miguel hesitated, then whispered, "Raoul, he's begging the bosses. Wants a rematch. Says he'll kill you himself." Daniel said nothing at first. He simply folded the bandages with military precision. Then, with a glance toward the window, he replied, "Then he better come prepared." Across the city, Raoul stood before a steel desk in a warehouse office, arms still sore from the last fight. His face, though mostly healed, carried a purple hue along the jawline, a silent mark of shame. His voice trembled with rage as he pleaded with 2 cartel lieutenants seated before him. "Give me a team," Raoul demanded, "and I'll end him." "I swear it." The men exchanged looks, skeptical. "You failed once," one said. "What makes you think this time will be different?" Raoul leaned forward, eyes blazing. "Because now, I don't want to win. I want to erase him." Permission was granted, not out of trust, but out of fear that inaction would make them look weak. Back in his temporary hideout, Daniel lit a candle and sat in silence. The flickering flame danced across his scarred face as he reflected on the truth Miguel had whispered. Raoul's defeat had shifted the city's balance. People no longer bowed to fear as easily, but the cost of that shift would soon come due. He rose and placed a hand on the wall, steadying himself as the wound above his brow throbbed faintly. The memory of glass breaking still echoed in his skull, but so did something deeper, resolve. He strapped a small knife to his ankle and slung his jacket over his shoulder. The time for planning was ending. The storm had moved. Now it would arrive in flesh and fire. San Relvas slept uneasily that night. In the narrow backstreets, whispers floated between doorways, tales of the man who shattered Raoul with nothing but fists and discipline. Some called him a soldier, others a ghost. But all agreed on one thing. He was still here. Daniel stood on a rooftop near the center of the city, staring down at the street below. Cartel spotters lingered in corners thinking they were unseen. He saw them all. He didn't smile, didn't flinch. He simply observed. In the quiet moments before dawn, his hands moved to the rifle he had disassembled and cleaned earlier. He wasn't planning an ambush. He was planning a statement. Somewhere across the city, Raoul gathered his men, drawing lines on a map Daniel had already memorized days before. The streets of San Relvas would soon echo again, not with rumors, but with reckoning. When men prepare for peace, war always finds them first. The moment Daniel stepped through the warped steel door of the warehouse, the trap was already in motion. The air inside was damp with salt and oil, thick with the scent of rusted chains and old blood. Flickering overhead lights cast long, shifting shadows across the cracked concrete floor, each one twitching like it held a weapon. There were no introductions, no warnings, just 20 cartel soldiers waiting in the dark, their boots scraping against metal and tension clinging to the walls like smoke. Raul Mendez stood at the center of it all, flanked by crates and oil drums, his posture rigid, his body still bruised from their last encounter. In his hands, a length of iron chain coiled like a serpent, its links dragging across the floor with a promise of violence. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, locked onto Daniel's with a hatred that had fermented into something personal. Around him, his men gripped blades, bats, crowbars, whatever pain they could carry, but none of them stepped forward. Not yet. Daniel didn't blink. He advanced with measured steps, the heel of his boots echoing in the silence. His breath was steady. His wounds had not fully healed, but his resolve had hardened like steel beneath scar tissue. Every movement was controlled, rehearsed. He was not here to survive. He was here to end it. "You came alone," Raoul sneered, his voice gravel scraped against bone. "Bold or stupid." "I came prepared," Daniel answered flatly. That was the only warning. Raoul lifted his chain like a whip, signaling the first wave. 5 men surged forward, their war cries sharp and eager. Daniel didn't retreat. He sidestepped the first swing of a machete, grabbed the attacker's arm, and twisted until a sickening pop echoed. The blade clattered to the floor. He pivoted, slamming an elbow into another man's nose, shattering it with precision. A third swung a metal rod. Daniel ducked low, grabbed a broken plank, and drove it into the man's knee. Screams followed. Raoul's expression didn't change, but the slight shift in his stance revealed a crack in his confidence. Daniel moved like he'd been born in chaos. The narrow rows between crates became traps he used against his attackers. He slammed one man's face against a rusted shipping drum, then rolled aside as another lunged with a crowbar. He caught it mid-swing, turned the momentum, and used it to drop the attacker with a heavy blow to the ribs. The cartel soldiers were many, but they weren't coordinated. Daniel broke their rhythm, forcing them into each other's lines of attack. He ducked a swing, pushed one man into another, and let confusion do half the work. 2 more dropped, then 3. Blood spattered the floor, mingling with oil and dust. Daniel's knuckles split open. His side throbbed from a hidden strike, but he didn't slow. His mind was focused. Every motion deliberate. Every blow a message. Across the room, Raoul growled in frustration. "You were supposed to die here." Daniel met his glare across the field of groaning bodies. So were they. Raoul didn't wait. He charged, swinging the chain like a flail, the links hissing through the air. Daniel dodged the first sweep, but the second cracked across his shoulder, the pain biting deep. He staggered, but not far. Raoul lunged again, driving the chain at his head. Daniel caught it mid-swing, yanking it toward him. Raoul stumbled forward, off balance, and Daniel struck. Fist to throat, knee to ribs. The chain dropped. Raoul recovered fast, grabbing a jagged pipe and thrusting it like a spear. Daniel twisted his body, narrowly avoiding a fatal hit. The pipe grazed his side. Blood bloomed, but he didn't stop. He grabbed Raoul's wrist, forced it upward, and drove his palm into Raoul's elbow with a crunch. Raoul screamed. The warehouse rattled with the sound. The last of his men, still conscious, froze where they stood, unsure whether to intervene or flee. Daniel stared them down, his chest rising and falling, his face streaked with blood and sweat. No one moved. Raoul dropped to one knee, gasping, his body trembling as his weapon clanged to the floor. Daniel stood over him, bruised, bleeding, but unshaken. His hand closed around Raoul's collar and dragged him up, slamming him against the nearest steel beam. Raoul's breath came in ragged bursts, his bravado long gone. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "They'll come for you. They'll burn this city to the ground." Daniel's voice was quiet, but unshakable. "Then I'll be waiting." The silence that followed was cold and final. Around them, cartel enforcers looked to one another, not for orders, but for exits. Daniel slowly released Raoul, letting him slump to the ground. He didn't need to say more. The message had already been carved into every fallen man and echoing breath. He had dismantled the cartel's enforcer not once, but twice, and this time witnesses would carry the truth in trembling voices. He turned and walked through the warehouse doors, his steps slow but firm. Behind him, Raoul lay broken, the chain still coiled beside him, now nothing more than a useless threat. Sometimes sparing a man wounds him deeper than killing him. Daniel Rourke stood motionless at the edge of the broken dock, watching the last of the cartel trucks disappear into the misty horizon. The tires kicked up dust, but it settled quickly, as if the city itself was eager to erase their presence. The early morning sky hung low and gray, heavy with the scent of salt and old blood. Silence lingered where chaos once roared. San Relvas had changed, but Daniel knew that change was rarely clean. It always left something behind. He glanced over his shoulder at the rusted anchor. Its structure had been rebuilt with fresh timber and reinforced beams, but the smell of smoke and shattered wood still clung to the place like an old wound. A single light flickered inside. Behind the bar, Miguel Vargas stacked bottles on shelves with quiet care, his hands steadier than they'd been in years. A nod passed between them, one of respect, of a shared history sealed in blood and survival. "Never thought I'd see this place without fear," Miguel had said the night before, his voice low, his eyes glassy from more than just whiskey. "You didn't just fight, Daniel." "You unshackled a city," Daniel hadn't responded. Not because he disagreed, but because praise felt hollow. He hadn't come to be a symbol. He'd come for peace. What he found instead was a mirror held up to the violence he had once fled. Now, as dawn broke over the harbor, Daniel's body ached from wounds both fresh and fading. His ribs were still bruised, his shoulder bandaged tight. He inhaled slowly, feeling the stitch of pain in his side, a reminder that survival always came with a cost. He rolled the shoulder carefully and adjusted the strap of his worn duffel bag. Its contents were sparse: a change of clothes, a canteen, and a photograph folded so many times it had begun to tear at the edges. It showed a younger version of himself standing beside two SEAL teammates, all three barely smiling, all three still whole. Footsteps approached. "You're leaving?" The voice was quiet, hesitant. Daniel turned. It was Tomas, the boy who once ran errands for Miguel and had been the first to whisper his name with reverence after the fight. He couldn't have been more than 17, but his eyes had aged faster than his face. Daniel gave a faint nod. "There's nothing more for me here." Tomas looked down, then back up, searching his face. "They talk about you, you know. Like you're some kind of ghost. A legend." Daniel almost smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ghosts don't bleed, and legends don't limp." The boy's eyes dropped to the dried blood on Daniel's pant leg, where the cloth had stiffened. "Still, what you did, it matters. Raúl's gone. The others won't come back, not after what they saw." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Tomas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded note. "Miguel told me to give you this." Daniel took it and opened the worn paper. Inside was a simple message in neat handwriting. No man can stop a storm, but sometimes one can teach the wind to change direction. He folded the note and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Tell Miguel thank you," he said. Tomas nodded and stepped back as Daniel turned toward the docks. A cargo ship sat moored at the far end, its deck quiet, crewmen asleep or waiting orders. He walked slowly, every step a blend of purpose and fatigue. The fog clung to his boots as he reached the final board of the pier, where the sea breathed against the city's edge like a beast trying to forget the taste of violence. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the water, listening. Behind him, San Relvas creaked awake, markets opening, shutters rising, the distant bark of stray dogs. But the tension that had once gripped the streets had loosened. No cartel trucks roamed, no shadows leaned too long into doorways. The city was not safe, not yet, but it had exhaled. For the first time in years, it had exhaled. Daniel adjusted the strap of his duffel and looked down at his reflection in the water. Blood still crusted the side of his face, dried now, dark as rust. He could wash it off, but not yet, not until he was somewhere else, somewhere quieter. A gull cried overhead. A wave slapped the dock. His grip tightened on the wood railing, and for a moment he considered staying, helping rebuild, guiding others. But peace demanded distance, and symbols cast dangerous shadows when they lingered too long. Without a word, Daniel turned and walked back along the dock. Not toward the city, but toward the road that curved along the cliffs. He didn't look back. The city would remember him, not by face, but by story. And stories, if told right, never needed retelling. The storm passed, but the memory of thunder lingered. Seconds later, the bar erupted. The man he struck was a Navy SEAL, and the entire floor fell into fists of reckoning. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of hidden strength, retaliation, and the explosive consequences of underestimating others. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire respect, accountability, and empathy in the face of conflict and injustice.